Hey guys, I recently took part in my first ever game jam, Ludum Dare 55. So let me take you through my entry, Elemental Evocation, which I barely managed to finish on time. Right, so the jam began for me at 2 AM, which wasn't the best time, so I had to wait until the next morning to find out the theme, which was announced as Summoning. So I had to get straight to planning, and I'm actually surprised by how quickly I came up with an idea. I hopped onto Sidenote and started writing down my thoughts. So to summarise, my concept was to create a magic themed strategy game where you'd summon waves of ghosts to try and take down enemy defences. The main catch would be the mana system, which would serve as both currency and health, making every decision a risk. I would of course be making the game 2D, as pixel art is the only art I can do, so the first step was to pick a palette. I didn't want to use my normal one, so I hopped onto low spec and scrolled for a few minutes before finding this one by Kerry Lake. I then made the actual Unity project, but I honestly had no idea where to start, so I figured I'd make the camera controller. Since you wouldn't be controlling a physical player, I wanted to make a basic pan and zoom, which was actually quite simple. Basically, you just take the way you were dragging last frame and move the camera in the opposite direction. I then spent way too long tweaking the sensitivity value, so hopefully it doesn't only work on my PC. Adding in zooming was really easy too, and that just about concluded the first hour of development. Sadly though, a movable camera wasn't quite enough, so I began with the UI, although I wasn't really sure what UI I actually needed. After searching Google for some inspiration, I found this image with a star that I quite liked, so I drew the mana bar and set that up in game. I also drew a few other small bits, but now that there was a UI in place, I needed to focus on the actual level. I had decided on a kind of spooky Halloweeny theme, so I drew up this ghost as well as this grass tile map. Don't ask why it's purple, it's magic or something. Lastly, before moving on to code, I spent about half an hour struggling to draw a castle, but it actually turned out surprisingly well in the end. Now time for the actual game bit. I spent the next hour making a few helpful utility scripts, adding in the spawning, and adding a really basic pathfinding AI to the spirits, which is basically just like a blind person holding out a walking stick, and if they hit something, they turn in a random direction and hope they don't get stuck. They were still pretty useless though, so I made this wind thing. I honestly have no idea what it's meant to be. Anyway, the air spirits shoot these out, and when they hit a tower it deals damage. It was really hard to tell though, so I quickly drew up these health bars and got them implemented. It's all good having them attack a single tower, but there was no targeting AI, and I kind of needed that. My approach basically involved checking which tower was the closest and on the lowest health, and choosing that if it wasn't already being swarmed. Only problem is that while it would work in theory, there was only one tower to target. But hey, that's a problem for another time. For now it seemed much more important to get the spirit placement working with an actual shop rather than a debug key, so it was back to the UI. I took that weird rune thing that I drew earlier, fixed it a bit, and then made two more copies, one for the upgrades and one for the army building screen. I wanted to have a fancy animation for opening this, and regrettably I did add it, which was a complete waste of an hour, but at least it looks nice, sort of. I then wasted almost another hour trying to get post-processing working, trying to make this weird line thing, and downloading a font which I never even ended up using. Amazing. Anyway, ignoring that, it was now time to tackle that only one tower problem from earlier. And what better way to do so than to copy Clash of Clans? Sorry, as I was saying, I used my creativity to come up with a wide array of medieval-inspired weaponry. I think they all actually ended up looking rather nice, which, as you might have guessed by now, meant switching to something else completely random to break the flow. Anyway, I spent a small while fixing the camera so that you can't go out of bounds, which resulted in a few crashes from while loops, but most of them were fairly easy fixes. More importantly though, I spent the next 2-ish hours drawing some UI for the spirit shop and getting that all set up. In my original plan, I had wanted to have multiple tiers unlockable, but let's just pretend that was never there. By now it was getting kind of late, so I went to bed and decided I'd just finish everything else tomorrow. The following morning when I got up, I wanted to get the game playable, and to do so I first needed a way of starting the round. I could have done this with yet another button, but I thought that was a bit boring, so I drew up this stone arch type thing with flags on either side. After I got the perspective looking alright on that, the next thing on the agenda was adding skeletons to all of the towers, which basically just involved copy pasting the king and changing his hat, but it honestly helped a lot with the game's feel. I now had a functional demo where I could place down spirit and start the round successfully, but there was still only the air type, so I made all 3 of the other ones. Just kidding, I only made the fire one and did the others at completely random times. For the fire guy anyway, it would shoot a fireball that did AoE damage, so I made this orange circle. It felt kind of rubbish though, so I fixed that by adding an explosion effect on impact, which was pretty much just an animated blob. I definitely could have improved it with some screen shake or something, but I figured that it might be a bit annoying if you placed down like 50 of them and it looked like there was an earthquake every time you attacked. By this point though, I had just over 12 hours left, which I found rather concerning, and I knew a main menu would be crucial, so that was the next logical step. I actually managed to come up with a name for this game, and since I seem to be loving the runic theme so much, I decided to engrave it in glowing letters on a big rock for the title. I could have gone with boring buttons or something for the UI, but I figured it would be more fun to make clickable gravestones. Getting the play and quit buttons hooked up was actually really easy, but I couldn't really be bothered with the tutorial or settings and instead went back onto gameplay. The next issue to tackle was the tower spawning, because a game with no enemies sucks. And as much as I'd love to pretend that I used some super clever algorithm to spawn them, I more or less just use random numbers and hope for the best. Turns out balancing isn't really a thing in game jams, or at least not for me. And speaking of unbalanced, I then hopped onto Desmos and made some questionably steep graphs for the difficulty curves, but too bad, it's just a skill issue if you lose, I guess. The game was still kind of unplayable though, as there was literally no text, so I added this small panel to show the cost of each troop, the amount of mana you had, and lastly this mid-round display to show the current wave, alive troops and number of towers. With those quality of life changes out of the way, I figured it was about time for another element, water, which if you got sick of me talking and went to go play the game already, you might have noticed is extremely broken. My plan was for them to be a fairly good healing troop that would shoot out these water bolts that bounce back and healed nearby spirits, only I forgot to cap the healing, so anyway, as I was approaching about 5 hours left, I noticed that the map still looked a bit uninspired, and what better way to hide that than by spamming a million trees around the edge. I wasn't really sure how to draw the trees, so I found this rather helpful reference image online and tried to draw mine in a similar-ish style. I made 3 colour variants and placed them literally everywhere, which already made the map look way better. I also placed down a few smaller gravestones which were the same as from the menu. Having scrapped my original idea of having the different tiers, I figured the least I could do for progression was to quickly throw together an upgrade menu. I again went with the runic theme and drew this weird bar thing with glowing rectangles, all of which are the exact same colour for every one of the upgrades. Look, I had like 2 seconds left. Anyway, I was still kind of missing any objective to the game besides destroying everything, so I added this super basic win-lose screen which played whenever you ran out of mana or destroyed the castle, and then finally completed the team with the earth guy. I went for this Thorns attack, kind of like the middle path druids in Bloons. These ones would be fairly tanky and deal quite a bit of damage, but would be super close range and would have increased aggro. With that done, the playing part of the game was more or less done, but the enemies were still unable to attack, so I spent a while adding in projectiles for each of the towers, and that concluded the game loop. I spent a while fixing some of the major bugs, although I am aware that I missed loads. It was pretty much midnight now, so I had to get the game done quickly. there was not a chance I'd be able to add anything to the menu, so I quickly threw together this basic tutorial that doesn't even work properly, and skipped the settings page entirely, although I did waste a bit of time trying to see what I could put. I decided that at this point polish was much more important, so I added some post-processing, which is actually like the best thing ever. It's like one of those instant powders, but for graphics. Just add water and the game looks 50 times better. With everything basically done, I actually did some playtesting, believe it or not. The main problem I found was that the game was really boring, so I decided the best solution would be to add a fast forward button. If the game sucks, just make it shorter, easy. So the game is now officially done and it was time to upload, but that's where the problems came. See, I've only ever built for Windows, not WebGL, so I had no idea what settings I was meant to use. I quickly read over the guide on the Ludum Dare website and tried copying over the settings shown. I hit build, and then waited. And waited. Well, actually I just went and uploaded the source code to GitHub, but I need to make it sound suspenseful, okay? I managed to get it uploaded with like 3 minutes left over, but it didn't even load properly. Thankfully it didn't matter since it turns out they gave you an extra hour for uploading, so I messed around a bit with the compression setting, and after 1 or 2 more tries it was all good. That sure was quite a busy weekend, and quite a long video to accompany it. If you do want to play the game, I have of course posted the link in the description, so feel free to give any feedback, positive or negative. If you'd like to see a part 2 to this video where I spend a week or so upgrading the game and adding all the missing features, be sure to like and subscribe. But with all that said, that's it for now. See you all in the next one.